Yes.
Perfect. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Toronto Science Policy Network's introductory workshop series, Research at Work, Science Policy 101. We are very excited to have you all here today to learn about how science is used to make evidence-informed policy. Yes, thank you. First, I will just outline the schedule for today's workshop. We're going to start with a brief introduction to science policy, and then more specifically focus on today's workshop. And then we'll move into a talk from our expert speakers, Rose and Jeremy. And following this, we will have an interactive activity for 20 minutes, and we'll leave a little time for audience questions before wrapping up. I'd like to briefly go over some housekeeping items before we begin. Please note that this event is recorded and it will be posted to the YouTube at a later date. This event has live captioning, which can be accessed by using the show subtitle button. Please keep yourself muted so the background noise would not be affected. Anyone's experience of today's workshop will use the Q&A function at the end of today's workshop for a short question and answer period. So TSPN would like to acknowledge that we are hosting this event on the traditional lands of many Indigenous nations. The Greater Toronto Area is the traditional territory of nations, and this land is covered by the Upper Canada Treaties and is protected by the Dish with One Spoon agreement. And today it is home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people, and we encourage each of you to learn more about the Indigenous nations on whose land we currently work and live. And we would like to remind everyone that we have a strict no harassment policy at our events, and we are dedicated to providing a harassment-free event experience for everyone. We do not tolerate harassment or offense in any form, and event participants violating any of these rules may be sanctioned or asked to leave the event at the discretion of the event organizers. So for TSPN, for anyone who is not familiar with us yet, TSPN, we are a student-run science policy group. So we're based out of University of Toronto. TSPN aims to provide platforms for students as well as postdoc researchers to learn more about and engage in science policy. TSPN is open to all disciplines and is inclusive of all areas of research. And since July 2018, we have organized a variety of events, engaging hundreds of individuals to date through science advocacy workshops like the one today, public panels, written pieces, and more. And we work with the community to advocate for evidence-based policy and to promote any discussion on the science behind key policies. So this workshop series is Science Policy 101 series. It's designed to teach you about the basics of science policy and to also connect you with experts to engage in this space. So to begin, we're going to take a look at this initial question, starting what is science policy? The term science policy can be used to define different things. It can be used to describe the way science is governed and allocated resources. It can also be used to describe how policy is formed based on evidence from science research. But in either case, it's this interface between science and policy that is incredibly important and has really such a significant impact on how the society functions. And we're just going to try to explain this a little bit more by touching on this second point here, which is where does science policy fit in with all forms of science translations? Or in other words, other ways to move science research to practical application. We've developed a map to help make sense of all the different ways that science can impact society. And so as we go through the next section, you can be thinking about the last question here, which is, where do I fit into this space? And where do your skills and interests might lie? So we're gonna go start off with this map that we are at TSPN built to help conceptualize how science policy fits into the world of science translation. Science translation is the overall umbrella term for this pathway, going from generating scientific knowledge, scientific research, to the ways in which that science knowledge is used and its implementations. And as you might imagine, this can occur through various paths. So a few of the main ways that this translation occurs are shown here. Scientific research is used to build the scientific body of knowledge, to increase the public's knowledge, and to create technologies, to create policies. At the very top, we have how scientific research is being communicated to the scientific community, which could eventually contribute to the whole scientific knowledge, body of knowledge. And this direct implementations can happen, for example, if we think about COVID, direct implementations of scientific knowledge might be clinicians using updating research on COVID to help their patients. And that'll be the green pathway. As for the purple pathway, moving down the pathway translating research to public, scientific research can be translated to the public either as information or as product and service. So think about new technologies which utilize scientific knowledge. And the process that we have included here are science advice and science advocacy. So science advice is when policymakers seek out advice from advisors who has more knowledge about the science that is relevant to the policies that they are writing or the decisions that they are making. Whereas science advocacy describes the push for the increased use of evidence for policymaking. So this is the pathway that we like to call science for policy. Science for policy, and it's the main focus of today's workshop. An example of direct implementation resulting from this pathway could be something like the mask mandates that were put in place in the evidence of COVID transmissions. And science advisors communicated the science and how the COVID spreads and how masks work to policymakers to help them write policies that could work and benefits the whole community. And of course, these are just some of the main examples that we've included in our map. There may be other steps that are involved, and there are definitely other similar terms that can be used to describe some of these steps. Maybe there are some that you guys are more familiar with that are used in your own discipline. And more importantly, all of these 4 components of knowledge translation can actually look back to inform what research is conducted next. Like what is known scientifically informs the next questions that can be asked, but what the public is interested in also contributes to what is studied. And the technology and tools that are available are also define what science can be performed and done. So for the workshop today, we will be focusing on the pathway of science for policy, and it'll be focused on, for today, we'll be starting with workshop 1, which is science policy advocacy. And we will explore communication strategies to advocate for science-informed policies to policymakers. And in the future, for workshop number 2, science of policy writings, we will learn about how science advice can also implement how policies are being written and made. And we are so pleased to have Dr. Rosa and Dr. Jeremy here with us today as our expert speakers.
Doctors, we're not doctors, but I appreciate the promotion.
Oh.
Doctor is nice.
Oh, very nice. Well, thank you so much for speakers coming here. We would like, so Rose is a seasoned professional with over a decade of healthcare policy. She has had advisory positions in government's politics and government relations. She brings together her unique and strategic insights on healthcare issues across all levels of government. Rose currently leads federal government relations strategies for the Canadian Cancer Society, with specific focus on health systems such as data, research, and access to cancer drugs. She earned her undergrad degree from the University of Toronto and master's degree in journalism from Columbia University. Jeremy is a community builder who has been involved in public service from a young age, elected at 26 as the member of provincial parliament for Ottawa West. He went on to serve as the vice chair of the finance committee and parliamentary assistant to the Minister of Children, Community, and Social Services. A long-term advocate for individuals with developmental disabilities, Jeremy successfully secured a multi-million-dollar investment to a new hospital expansion for kids with special needs, and helped oversee the transformation of clinical services for these children province-wide. He holds a Master of Public Policy degree from the University of Oxford and is a senior fellow at the Monk School of Global Affairs and Public Policy, and is the past recipient of the United Way's Community Builder of the Year Award. And thank you so much, both, for joining us here today. And I'll give you the floor to share your experience in policy.
Great. Okay, I have to stand because I can't see past this. I could just say next, if that works. That works. Okay. Thank you so much for, I feel like this is really awkward. Thank you so much for inviting us both here today. This is just really great to see so many eager people figuring out early in your careers how to take your research and move it into clinical practice or public policy. And that's exactly what I do. So slide, I guess. I'm going to keep this presentation really short, and I will say that I've been giving a version of this presentation for the past several months. Bryn has come to a version of this virtually with the Canadian Cancer Society last year. And what really want to emphasize is what government relations is. And I might just keep saying GR, so apologies if I keep saying that, but government relations really is the ability to influence and shape public policy on a specific objective. For the Canadian Cancer Society, our objective is cancer care policies at all levels of government, municipal, provincial, and federal. And while healthcare is delivered mostly provincial and territorial, all levels of government are involved with public policies that shape cancer care issues. So the reason why I think we're here today is to emphasize why government relations mean something to you, whether you're actively engaged in advocacy now or in the future, or whether you continue your research and your career in science. Is public policy shapes the work that you do, whether you feel it directly or indirectly. So understanding it is very important. So for us at the Canadian Cancer Society, cancer is unfortunately the leading cause of death for Canadians. And there's lots of progress that's being made in this area. Unfortunately, incidence and prevalence continues to rise with our aging and growing population. So we want to ensure where there's gaps in public policies that impact cancer care, we want to close those gaps and ensure that government can help support Canadians who are living with or beyond cancer. So I'll give you 2 case studies to contextualize what this means to you. First, I think a lot of you were impacted by the recent announcements in the federal budget 2024, with the research funding and the graduate stipends. And congratulations to everyone who was part of that activity. It obviously took many years to do that. And I think that really explains to you why advocacy is important for your day-to-day, whether it's the research that you do or just the impact to your lives. And then I'll give you an example that I'm working on, but that I'm actually really tired about right now because I have a huge forum happening next week on cancer clinical trials and how to connect the research that the leading experts and oncologists and clinicians in the country are doing on cancer clinical trials into policy. So next slide, please. Okay, so this is my favorite saying, which is really often in policy, we often miss the forest for the trees. And this is a situation that often happens with experts, where you might be involved with your little niche area. So the trees, researchers, scientists, experts, who tend to focus your niche areas, and you forget to kind of see the bigger picture of what's shaping the work that you're doing. And there often seems to be a disconnect in languages. what you might say to the community that you work with, your graduate classmates, your advisors, university, may not really translate to public policy. It's different language. So we need to make sure that there's a connection in the language that we're using in order to successfully move your research into public policy proposals. There's often missing foresight, and the years of hard work that you're doing in your research area may unfortunately go to waste if you're not able to see the bigger picture of what's happening, whether it's cuts to funding that impacts the work that you do, or a complete redirection of government policy that impacts the work that you do. And there's also mismatched priorities. And this is the one fundamental thing that I often say to even experienced researchers across the country in cancer care. If your priority does not align in some way with government priority of the day, it will not move forward. And you can do all of the advocacy that you believe is important to you, but if you cannot make the case to the government of the day, and I think Journey might have examples of that, it will not move forward. So here are the opportunities though. Government relations is about seeing that forest. It's about seeing the bigger picture of what's happening. And you can poke your head up from your little niche area, just understand this is what's happening with the policy areas that you're focused on or what your work impacts. And understanding that, even if you don't participate in it, is really important to your career as well as the passionate work that you do. So next slide, please. And so just a really quick understanding of what CCS does or Canadian Cancer Society does. Our top 5 areas of focus at the federal level is to focus on what I call multi-stage, multi-year efforts. A lot of these issues will not happen tomorrow. They may not happen in the next few months, but they will happen over the years. And so currently at the federal level, we're focusing on supports for caregivers who have care of people who are impacted by cancer. And that means if you take time off from work to take care of your loved one, you should have federal supports and government supports to make sure that you are okay to take that time off. It's about improving access to cancer drugs. And access to drugs is a growing challenge for people as cancer drugs become more expensive, treatment becomes more diverse, and cancer is really becoming a set of rare diseases rather than one type of treatment. There's also our really strong, passionate colleague of mine, who I jokingly call Tobacco Rob at this point. He is very passionate about restricting flavors in e-cigarettes and making sure that we can have that at all levels of government, advocating to provincial governments to reduce the flavors, restrict the flavors, as well as federal government, as well as to have municipal bylaws on that. We're seeing a rise in vaping trends for young people, and we need to reduce that rate. We also want to start to educate the population of what it really means for alcohol as a class 1 carcinogen and why alcohol is related to cancers. Now, it is poor public policy for us to immediately advocate for banning alcohol. There will be no uptake. I still drink alcohol. I'm sure many of you do. But it's understanding what the risks are as part of the first steps towards your advocacy. And then finally, our 5th area of focus is cancer data. The cancer data, as so many of you know, data in general helps to inform public policy planning, helps to understand what to anticipate and how to ensure that resources are being used to the right areas. Some of our recent advocacy wins, even though we are at a multi-year, multi-stage across the cancer experience, it's quite hard to have big wins, include an extension of federal EI benefits from 15 weeks to 26 weeks, which took years to implement. Individual cigarette warnings. We were the first country in the world to have individual cigarette warnings on packaging. And I'm very proud to say that the involvement of creating our first all-party cancer caucus at the federal level on Parliament Hill that happened last year. And in fact, with Jeremy's former boss, MP Dan Elvis. So these are some of the activities that we do and what our goals are for public policy. Next slide, please. But in the context of all these things, and as I mentioned, even though cancer is the leading cause of death in Canada, and even though cancer prevalence and incidence is on the rise, it is not enough at this point to shape public policy without understanding what else is happening as government priorities. So good government relations strategies, figuring out how to tip that scale in your favor when that scale is tipping the other way. And what influences the government is what influences what the media trends are. So some of those trends includes what are the government priorities of the day federally and really across all levels of government is now cost of living crisis, the housing crisis. We are all feeling that impact day to day more than many of us are feeling the impact of cancer. We know that the political scandal of the day happens to dominate media. Jeremy probably could tell you a lot about that from his perspective. And knowing what the average voter feels and how that influences how public policy is shaped. We also know that governments of the day already have their healthcare agenda. So whatever they're focused on for their priorities in the areas that my organization wants to focus on may not be disease specific, for example. And understanding, again, what's influencing the news cycle. All of those things tend to dominate how and what is prioritized and how public policy is shaped. And it's my job as a registered lobbyist for the Canadian Cancer Society to tip that scale in a favor that supports cancer care policies. And that's the importance of why government relations is important. Next slide, please. So really, this is a interesting slide I actually shared with a bunch of researchers in Vancouver just a few weeks ago. And what they really didn't understand is that, cancer is political, research is political, all of these things are political. No, we don't talk about politics. You might not talk about politics, but politics impacts you. And fundamentally, cancer is a public policy issue because it impacts so many Canadians. And it's also a public policy issue because it is paid for mostly by our Medicare system. So you can see examples of where there has been influence federally, provincially, and municipally of governments that might change the policies on municipal smoking bylaws or the need for municipal smoking bylaws, provincial coverage of cancer treatments, whether there's cuts to research funding or a change in CAR-T cell therapy treatments in BC, as well as federal funding in cancer research. All of these things are impacted on a day-to-day. And if you are a cancer researcher or someone who's in a lab, your work might be impacted by a cut in the funding that supports your work. So again, it's really important for you to understand what's the bigger picture here as you move forward in your career. Next slide, please. So here's what matters to you. And a lot of you were leading the work in this efforts. Public policy issue, for example, which was announced just a month ago in budget 2024 at the federal level, was a major increase in federal funding for graduate stipends, because the issue was that the graduate stipends were not keeping up cost of living or ensuring that there was no brain drains. And I want to ask, was anyone impacted by federally funded graduate stipends before this announcement? Did anyone receive federally funded graduate stipends? So you felt that impact directly. And what you did, along with your community of graduate students and other people, was you used your voice. You came up with a plan and you focused on a specific way to move that forward. And you made a specific call, and that call was to increase the stipend amounts so that you can have the cost of living relative to what you were going to earn as a graduate student. So many of you, I guess, were also involved with the op-eds, with the advocacy work, support our science. I think some of you said you were involved with support our science, which is fantastic, and it took years. And it led to a lot of public awareness of why this impacted the safety and structure of health research and graduate studies in Canada. So finally, the things that were impacting you were put in front of government. And because of that, it led to a massive increase in graduate stipends for graduate students and hopefully stability in our academic networks. So this is how advocacy impacts your day-to-day, whether it's your research or your personal lives or professional lives. And next slide. Another example is the research funding. Again, the concern here was that Canada was not keeping up the pace with research investments that we needed to ensure that we continue to be a global leader in various aspects of research, whether it was health research, technology, AI, et cetera. So again, there was a lot of advocacy work that was done with institutions like the University of Toronto and other institutions to come together to make a call to government to say, if you do not raise research funding, this is the impact that will be felt detrimentally on our society. This led to the federal government deciding to hold a consulting, a very long consulting process an advisory panel, which released a report, which then led to the decision being made to increase research funding for the first time in over 2 decades. So if there was no advocacy or government relations in these areas, it is unlikely that the research funding would have increased. It was the pressure from the public, from the community, and from stakeholders who came together to make a case of what they needed to see and why it matters to Canadians. So I want to give you, next slide, an example of what we're doing at the Canadian Cancer Society to connect research to policy. But before I get there, I wanted to highlight, I think this is really important. I say this information to my own colleagues here. The Canadian Cancer Society is the leading cancer charity in the country, but we are not the only cancer charity in the country, and that's great news. What sets Canadian Cancer Society apart from other cancer organizations and other advocacy groups is what I call our crown jewels. And there's 3. There's our patient feedback. We have a huge patient network across the country. We're able to tap into what the community is feeling about lack of access to treatment, lack of access to prevention, other gaps in the cancer continuum, to bring those voices to Parliament. So we will have a lobby day every year nationally, where we go and bring voices from patients, caregivers to Parliament Hill to meet their members of Parliament and senators. The second crown jewel for the Canadian Cancer Society that sets us apart and helps with our advocacy is information and data. Our website, cancer.ca, is the most frequently accessed website for cancer information. Often we're told, and this is by government officials as well, when you're first diagnosed with cancer, as much of a shock as it is for you, you tend to go to cancer.ca to find out what's next. So our ability to provide information, our offer to society and to government is what sets our advocacy apart from other organizations. We also released an annual cancer stats report with Public Health Agency of Canada, and it says Health Canada, it's really Stats Canada here. And that's our work to bring information and use that information to help to advocate, well, there's an increase of incidence and prevalence, and that's why we need to address these public policy issues in cancer care. Lastly, our third crown jewel is research and innovation. And we are one of the largest funders of cancer research in Canada. We fund about $45 million in cancer research every year. And that goes through from discovery to trials and implementation, all forms of research. And we have built a really strong academic and expert network. Right now, I am taking that network and putting them into advocacy so that I can amplify the leading voices of cancer care and cancer prevention in this country in front of government officials, because their voices are credible versus just me as a registered lobbyist. Next slide, please. So taking all these things, we can see that this is the ecosystem technically of, who shapes public policy. So as large as the Canadian Cancer Society is, as the leading cancer charity in the country, we're one of many voices. And that's one of many voices amongst stakeholders, amongst the policy experts, but we also have government, we also have general public, we have the punditry class, we have media, we have bureaucracy, we have opposition political parties, all who influence the way that public policy might be shaped today and for time to come. So it is within these bubbles that we understand why politics matters, why we know that everyone has the potential to influence public policy, but maybe not equally, and who we need to work with to get our bubble a little bit bigger, to have our voice a little bit stronger in shaping public policy. Next slide. So here's our case study for cancer. We are about to host a large cancer clinical trials forum next week in Ottawa. And the problem, and when you think about what is the problem you're trying to solve, it always has to connect back to who you're supporting. And those should be Canadians, Torontonians, Ontarians, doesn't matter. Who are you supporting? It's people. It's not your research for the sake of research, it's how your research is impacting people. So the problem that I'm trying to solve right now is how do I modernize and create a national clinical trial system for cancer where I can improve access to treatment for people who need to get treatment through trials faster and more efficiently across the country. And for government, why it matters is how can I better support research and innovation and transform that into clinical practice and economic growth. And how am I solving this public policy problem that's been in the works for over a decade? Well, I'm bringing the research to the politicians. It's not me having a report that I've had in a roundtable in Toronto or in Vancouver. I'm bringing the researchers to Ottawa next week so that they can meet face-to-face with politicians. And by bringing these prominent research who have credibility, who work with patients, who are leading the work in this country and globally, their prestige and credibility helps to echo what we're saying. So it's not just me, registered lobbyist, who's saying these things. It's my living network of researchers who are saying those things with me. And I have two prominent researchers who are co-chairing this event. Dr. Rebecca Auer, she's a surgeon scientist based at the Ottawa Hospital, a cancer rock star, if you can say, and Dr. Janet Dancy, who is the executive director of the Canadian Cancer Clinical Trials group based out of Queens. I'm taking the work that they're doing in the field and putting it in front of them. And I'm making sure that the priorities are overlapping. So the focus on clinical trials, the need was there for sure, but it also aligned with the government agenda of the day, which was the focus on research and innovation, as you saw in budget 2024, as well as a desire to see a growth in research and innovation in a post-emergency COVID-19 world. And I've created buy-in from the start. So I have used this opportunity to have a Cancer Caucus meeting where some of our champions on the Hill get to champion the cause that we're having next week. And I also have political guest speakers. So each day of this workshop, I have a former federal health minister, Dr. Jane Philpott, coming in to speak to researchers so that she can also give advice how to translate research into policy. And then the following day, I have from Health Canada, the interim deputy minister, Eric Costin, and Health Canada's chief medical advisor, who can also give that explanation of how do you translate really technical, like nerdy policy into something that makes sense for governments, for decision makers, for people like Jeremy, who only have 10 minutes to read a brief before they make a decision. This is what its key is, that knowledge translation. And really, what are the outcomes? TBD. I hope that everyone's going to cross their fingers for me and hope that it's really successful. But what the outcomes will be is that we'll have a report that is based on the expert opinion of both patients, researchers, that are also being made as people who are the decision makers are at the table. And then I'm going to shop that report across the country and say, thank you for coming to this workshop. Here's a report. Please put this into policy. And it's going to be a months-long process, but at least I've created buy-in from the start. And I've taken all of the work that our great researchers do in cancer innovation and trials. I put that into a package that's easy to understand and relate back to Canadians. Why does it matter for them? Because we want to improve access to cancer treatment and innovation. And we also want to make Canada a global leader in this work. And this is why it matters to Canadians, and this is why it matters to government. So that's the connect for research to policy and advocacy. I think that's it. Yeah. Okay, thank you.
Awesome. Well, Rose, what a fantastic presentation, particularly kind of outlining, you know, when you're coming from the outside in to government and trying to figure out how to advocate. And I wish I could sit here and say that every group that comes and speaks to government is as strategic as the kind of plan that Rose has just outlined for you. But unfortunately, that's not always the case. And that's why I think events like this are such a fantastic opportunity to get to learn a little bit about how do you strategically think about getting your ideas from kind of concept into implementation. You know, I thank you very much, Vernon, for the introduction before. I am a recovering politician. So I'm one of the less dangerous politicians. I'm on the other end of the spectrum on the way out. But I also have a little bit of a connection to this world. Actually, my partner John is here with us tonight. John is a researcher at Sick Kids and just did his master's at IMS at U of T. And so I've learned way more in the past 4 years about protein inhibition and protein pathways by editing theses and papers than I ever thought I could possibly imagine before. So I have a little snapshot into the world that all of you guys inhabit. What I thought I'd do first is I'm just going to provide a little bit of background on kind of my journey into politics, just to set the stage on the perspective that I bring to the table. So I actually got involved in politics when I was really, really young. I was 14 years old when I first started getting involved in politics. And I got involved in politics because of my younger brother, Dylan. So Dylan, he's a year younger than me. Dylan loves potato chips. He swims like a fish. He is a huge Barney the dinosaur aficionado. But he is also nonverbal autistic with a severe developmental delay and also suffers from epilepsy, which over the course of my family's life presented a lot of challenges for us in advocating with different levels of government, particularly with the provincial government, for more supports, primarily from the healthcare, education, and social services sectors. And when I was 14, Dylan was 13. He was kind of entering those difficult teen years that are often very challenging for individuals on the spectrum. And Dylan went through a period where he was either constantly having severe behavioral issues, being very violent, aggressive, tantrums, outbursts, etc. Or on the flip side, was constantly having seizures. And the doctors that we were dealing with at CHEO in Ottawa, I'm originally from Ottawa, were telling us that Dylan needed to get his medications more balanced. The teachers were having to send him home from school on a regular basis. My dad had to take time off work on stress leave. My mom lost her job. I was missing months on end out of my high school year at the time because all of us were playing that role of caregiver and trying to figure out how to deal with all these challenges that my brother was facing. The doctors finally told us that what we needed to do was we needed to get my brother into a residential care home where he could get that 24/7 care that he needed to kind of get those medications balanced, get him on a more stable track, and also stabilize our family to a degree. Let my parents try and get back to work, let me get back to high school. Problem was the price tag for this was $85,000 per year. Which I don't know about any of you, but we didn't have that lying around in a sock drawer at the time. So my dad and I started doing some research and we found out that there was a social services panel that we could go and present to ask for emergency funding. And so I told my parents I was going to go and present on behalf of the family. I went, presented, and pleaded our case. And very fortunately, we got the funding for my brother. He got into a group home. He is doing much better now. He's much more stabilized, much better environment. I just saw him last weekend. He and I took my mother out for Mother's Day, and he sat there and ate, I am convinced, about 30 breakfast sausages in a row. But he was happy as a pig in shit, as they say. But all of that experience kind of was my first exposure to the political world and why government matters and why political decisions matter. And after that whole advocacy journey that my family went on, I started to hear about other families who were going through the same thing. And for a lot of these families, the point that they ultimately reached is they would actually have to give up their children to children's aid services, which no family should ever be pushed into that situation based on not getting, whether it's the clinical or respite supports that they need for their children. So I decided at that time I was going to get involved in politics. So I started volunteering on campaigns. I started meeting with politicians, talking to them about these issues. Ended up having the opportunity to work as a political aide to the finance minister back in kind of the early 2010s, where I got to work when I was about 18, 20 years old on a national autism strategy in Canada, which was phenomenal to kind of be able to be part of those conversations, pulling together those stakeholder groups, that research, those key players to work towards a better vision of what the government could be doing in this space. Went off after that, did my master's, and then came back and decided, you know what, I'm going to put my money where my mouth is, and I'm going to run for politics. And ran for office and was very fortunate, got elected in 2018 by 175 votes. It was the smallest margin in that Ontario election back then. And then over the course of the next 4 years, as well as dealing with issues like COVID and other key priorities, really tried to work to advance policy on areas that I cared about, worked on a pilot project for children with special needs who have multiple complexities that's running at a number of hospitals right now, worked on a hospital expansion, worked on reforming the beleaguered autism services clinical program that exists in Ontario. So a number of things in that sphere that were very close personal passion projects for me as well. And then in 2022, unfortunately, lost re-election. And so now I'm back on the outside, but getting the chance now through my work with the Monk School to kind of work on teaching other young people, including two of my students who are here today, who have to hear me give the same talk that I gave this past year over again, but getting the chance to try and provide roadmaps for other people who might be like me, who have a cause that they want to champion, but don't know how to get it through and navigate it through the dark arts of politics and that whole kind of crazy world there. So with the benefit of kind of that backdrop, I'll dive into a little bit of the meat and potatoes. So, you know, in terms of navigating politics and getting stuff done in the political system, there's really two things that I think are most important to keep in mind. First one is you need to understand that politicians are human, some of them less so than others, but they're human, and politicians have limited bandwidth. There are so many issues that are coming at a politician at any given day. During COVID, I would bounce from meeting to meeting, 15-minute blocks, long-term care, business, education, pro-vaccines, anti-vaccines, boom, 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 meeting with constituents, stakeholder groups, whatever it might be, and you're getting bombarded with asks from different people. And politicians really can only ever work on advancing so many priorities at one time. And so there's a bunch of different things that I think are really important to keep in mind when you're thinking about that bandwidth. And I always tend to summarize them by the 3 C's. When you're coming in to talk to a politician, you want to be clear, concise, and compelling, right? So, you know, I'll give you an example. We would have groups that would come in and they would sit down and they'd say, okay, Mr. Roberts, here are the 15 biggest problems facing us. And they would proceed to lay out a litany of problems. And no doubt, these were serious issues that needed to be addressed, but because there was so much stuff on the table, I had no idea what to do with it, right? You have that many different things coming towards you. You're trying to figure out what should I focus on at any particular time. So if you're going in to meet with a politician, you know, on behalf of an organization like cancer or on behalf of something that you're advocating for, try and be clear and concise in terms of what it is that you want the politician to take away from the meeting. The flip side of that is you oftentimes get a lot of groups that come in just with problems and no solutions. And again, that's an easy way to kind of get yourself dropped off of a politician's bandwidth, because if at the end of the day, a politician is looking and they've had, you know, 25 meetings throughout the day, and only 3 of them came with actual solutions to a problem, you're going to focus on those because you have something tangible that you can latch on to and say, okay, this is something we can work with. So always keep in mind, you know, yes, there are issues that you're dealing with, but you also want to try and be part of the solution and come forward, again, not with 15 different solutions, but with, you know, 1 or 2 clear ideas that you're advocating for, that you want that politician to look at actioning in a particular way, whether it's advocating with a minister, whether it's speaking to civil servants, whatever the case may be. So that's number 1 is thinking about those bandwidth issues. I think that's so incredibly important. Number 2 is trying to tap into and think like a politician. So what I mean by this, you're coming in and you have a great policy idea, right? Perhaps it's advocating for more funding for cancer research, whatever it might be. You're going to have a ton of kind of policy reasons for why the government should do this. They might be based on scientific research, they might be economic arguments, they might be impact arguments, objective data, you know, different things like that. Those are all things that are going to be part of your pitch. But politicians also have that separate list of criteria that they're thinking about, which are the political criteria of what policies they should choose to advance. There's a political strategist out of Australia, a guy named Linton Crosby. If you like him, you call him the Wizard of Oz. If you hate him, you call him the Lizard of Oz. It's kind of two different camps. But Crosby has this fantastic matrix in terms of analyzing issues from a political lens that I think is so helpful. He says that every single issue, if you're thinking about it from a political lens, you should look at 4 criteria. So number 1, is the issue salient? Is it something that is generally being talked about? Are people aware of this? Is it something that if you bring it to the politician, they're going to go, oh yeah, I've heard about that. That's been in the news, or I've been hearing about that. So salient issues, like right now, something like housing is a massively salient issue, right? If you're thinking about examples of salient. So that's number 1. Number 2, and this one arguably I think is the most important, it's personal relevance. So the politician wants to be able to think about, how do I connect what you're talking about here to average everyday people's lives? What does that story look like? And the way I tend to tell people how to approach this is, think about it this way. Imagine that you are the politician and you're going around knocking on doors in your hometown, and you get to somebody's door and you want to explain your policy to an average layperson. How are you going to do that? What does that story look like in terms of how it will impact their day-to-day lives, or their kids' lives, their friends, their neighbors, their community? Think about that personal relevance piece. The next one is political differentiation. So politicians, it's a competitive sport. There's different parties, different teams. Oftentimes, politicians don't want to do something if it's the exact same position as their opponents. Because if a voter looked and had 2 choices, why would they pick you over the other person if you're both offering the exact same thing? So sometimes you want to think a little bit about, how can you position your idea in a way that shows that if you do this action, you're going to be differentiated in a positive way from your political opponents. And then the last piece is something called voter choice. And so what this means is that politicians often think about elections in terms of questions. So they want voters to have a particular question in their mind when they go and cast their ballot. So maybe it's, do I want a highway built, or do I want farmland preserved? Do I want a carbon tax, or do I want money back in my pocket? It's all about those choices, right? Politicians think like that. So you want to think about, how would you go about framing your particular idea, whatever your pitch is, in terms of a choice that makes sense in that dichotomy. So as you think about the ideas that you're advocating for, take a moment once you finish, bolstering your policy case and doing all that hard work and the real work of looking at the data, the objective data, the subjective data, all that. And then think about the political case and think about those 4 criteria. You're not going to be able to tick off all the boxes. Sometimes you can't make a case on salience because an issue is much more niche. Oftentimes, a lot of the advocacy work that I did for individuals with special needs, it wasn't very salient. It wasn't like everybody was talking about this at any time. But the more of those boxes you can figure out how to tick off as you frame your issue, the higher chance you're going to have of getting it on that politician's agenda. I'll finish before we open it up for questions with just one great example of this. Earlier in my class this term at Monk, I invited a friend of mine, Alex Munter, who's the CEO of CHIO, the Children's Hospital in Ottawa. And Alex provided a fantastic example of kind of this at work. So this past year, you might have heard that the Ontario government did a huge boost in funding for pediatric healthcare. You might have heard that in the news back in the day. And so what happened there is that all of the pediatric hospital CEOs in Ottawa, I think there's about 7 of them, banded together and decided, listen, instead of going at the government from every different direction with different priorities, let's unify together, understand their bandwidth challenges, and have one united ask. We want a big increase in pediatric healthcare funding to support the shortfalls that our hospitals are facing and our inability to provide patient care in the right way. And then thinking about those political criteria on salience, they knew that there was a window of opportunity because in the public domain, because of COVID, there was a lot of talk about children's hospital capacity. And to top that off, RSV came onto the picture, and there was a ton of stories in the news about children's hospitals being overwhelmed because of RSV and COVID and flu season. So they used that salience as a good window to go in and target the government. On personal relevance, all the hospital CEOs identified patient stories at their hospitals that they could use to paint that picture for decision makers about what does this underfunding that exists, how does that actually impact families in their communities? On differentiation, it was as simple as saying, listen, you will be the first government in a generation to do this. You can go out there and say, we are the government that got this done and did this. And on voter choice, they framed it around caring about children. You know, do you support a government that cares about children, that makes this investment? So that's kind of the main things that I hope you guys can take away from this, is as you navigate your way through your careers, whether you're working in science research or advocacy or in the healthcare sphere, wherever it might be, if you get a chance to get in front of decision makers, remember their bandwidth, be clear, concise, and compelling, and then think about those political aspects of building your case, because that's something that's going to help make sure that you stand a better chance on getting on that agenda. So with that, I'll turn it over.
Thanks so much. So we can open it up for a couple minutes for questions if anyone has any, and the people online can put questions in the chat. We've got some people watching the chat as well. But if there isn't right now, oh, we'll wait and see if something gets up in the chat. But if there's not right now, we can.
We've got a question here.
Oh, we got a question.
I had a question for you, Rose, on setting priorities. You have 5 enumerated for the Community Cancer Society. And I was wondering, when you present that to politicians or to stakeholders, how in detail can you go when it's a broad idea or a broad concept that you want to be able to summarize in a few things?
Well, so really going back to Jeremy's point is bandwidth is often I'll have a lobbying booklet that outlines those priorities that I send in a pre-email. Tell them that I might have a specific ask because it's related to a legislative component, whether it's a motion or something that's happening in the House. And explain that I'm looking to focus on that specific ask, and ask them if they have any specific questions out of those 5 areas, because it's just not good use of their time or my time to go through all 5 areas. Because it's bandwidth. It's many of these issues are multi-stage, multi-year. Some may not become prominent, such as the alcohol related ask. There is no clear ask besides the educational awareness of it. So I would not bring that in front of the government official. I also do the political assessment. So I know that my focus will change depending on the political party or the decision maker that I'm speaking to. My ask will be different for an NDP MP, for example. I might focus on drugs because of their push for pharmacare, versus a conservative MP where I might focus on data or the efficiencies of government by having information, versus the government of the day, the liberal government, federal level, where I might focus on how the work that I'm trying to advocate on aligns with their government, their agenda of the day. So I certainly narrow it down, and that's a challenge that the Canadian Cancer Society constantly has, because we are across the country, multi-stage and multi-levels of government. How do we focus it in? We do our homework, we have a clear ask, and we root it in back to why it matters to Canadians always. Thank you.
Such a great point, and so often missed as well is the fact that you do want to think about who your audience is, right? The way you frame a policy ask to the federal government under Prime Minister Trudeau is going to be different than the way you would frame it to a provincial government under a Premier Ford, right? You want to think about what are their priorities, what kind of language do they speak, what are things that they are currently talking about? Is there a way that I can frame my ask within something broader that they're currently working on or that they believe in? And it's amazing the number of people that kind of miss that. And that's an easy way to get yourself kind of streamed out. right at the gate is just the language you use to talk about something.
Other questions?
Yeah, I have two questions. The first one I'm gonna ask is, from what was being discussed, and I can see this, there's like a certain bias, right? If you had personal experience related to that brother, and that's why you kind of followed up on policy related to that. I'm just curious of how would, for instance, and you were in office, so how would someone approach you when you don't have that personal connection? Because that automatically kind of biases you to certain issues. So how would you, so that was my first question, it's like, if you don't say have that personal connection or history or that salience, because a lot of key issues don't have salience. And I think maybe for me, the goal of the government is to be maybe future less reactive and more proactive. So, you know, start working on issues before they become salient. So how would you go about, you know, like supporting those issues? And I guess from my second question is, how would you know, where should we look at, figure out how does our issue, if you have a certain cause, how does that fit into the overarching strategy of a certain government? Like, do you look at the budget, or like what are the sources that individuals should look at to see like where can I fit this in? Right, so yeah, I'm just curious of like, how would you get your issue if it's dependent on the person's biases, and also how do you fit it up into this broader scheme of what's important for the country?
I'm just gonna repeat the question because we got a message that online they couldn't hear the question very well. So I'll just try to say it closer to the microphone and louder and try to summarize it. But so the question was basically about, so let's say you have an issue where either the representative that you're talking to doesn't have a personal connection to it, or it's not very salient currently in the news or in the public eye. What are kind of some strategies that you can use to get your idea through despite those challenges? Is that right?
Yeah, also tying it back to make it really but tying it back to how would you find what those core priorities are, and then for you to fit it into that, make it relevant.
Yeah, no, great question. Let me bust that down to three parts if I can. So first of all, personal relevance. Personal relevance isn't just to, I'll talk about kind of pitching to your audience in a second, but personal relevance is more about painting your picture in more human terms. So it may not be directly relevant to the politician that you're speaking to, but making it clear for him what this means for his constituents, right? Again, that idea of if you were speaking to some random person on the street, a lay person who knows nothing about it, how would you explain how your policy might impact them or their family or their friends or their community, et cetera. So that's the important part of the personal relevance. And that's often the toughest part, I think, because sometimes we get very caught up in kind of the high level of our policy, like what kind of the grand vision is, and we forget to paint those individual pictures. And oftentimes those individual pictures are what make your policy stand out to decision makers, because you know, so often groups will come in and say to government, we're underfunded. Okay, everybody's underfunded. I've heard that story before, but what'll make this story stick out in my mind is you telling a story about, I'll use personal example, you know, a child with special needs with multiple complexities who, you know, the family is at breaking point, at crisis point, is being told that they need to spend $85,000 or else they have to give up their child. You know, this is wrong. My policy is going to step in, and by providing more funding for these services will prevent stories like that. So that's the personal relevance. On the audience piece, just quickly, I'm sure Rose will have some stuff to add to this as well. But in terms of pitching to your audience, you know, when you're thinking about the government-wide agenda, look at things like budgets, speeches from the throne, even something as simple as just going on, all the governments have like a news release deposit that you can go on and you can search by ministry, you can search by health and say, what are the things they've announced lately? What kind of language are they using? You know, and is there a way that I can kind of fit my ask within their broader kind of vision or what they're putting forward as their proposition to voters? And on the individual basis, and this is when you're going really macro and saying, okay, I'm meeting with X decision maker, I want to find a way to make it relatable to them. You know, you try and you know, go down through the different layers. So oftentimes I would have groups that would come in and advocate, for example, on behalf of cancer research. And a couple of them would actually open their presentation by tapping into my experience as a caregiver. So Jeremy, I understand, having read online, that you have a younger brother with special needs, you know, and you've had a lot of challenges caring for them and advocating for them. I had a very similar experience, you know, with my you know, wife who had cancer. And we had to go through an advocacy journey, and it's been very tough as a caregiver, taking time off work and all that. You find those kind of common areas that you can tap in on, and that's where you're kind of going from Padawan to master level at government relations, where you're really finding out what makes an individual decision maker tick and figuring out how to tap into that. That'll be things that kind of bring you even to that next level beyond just tapping into the government framework.
Yeah, and I think I'll almost flip what Jeremy said. Is I like to make a joke, because cancer is always dark, is that I'm a professional gossip, thief, and gossiper. I basically do that research. I will, I find it very painful to watch question period at all levels of government, by the way, so I can't do that, but
Painful being in it.
I bet, yeah. But I will scan for the word cancer every single day to see who brought up, and often you'll hear members of parliament just announce, well, you know, my sister has cancer. In fact, that happened today. So I reached out to a member of parliament I've never connected with in Quebec to invite him to the event that's happening next week. And so really, it's just that the connect is doing the research, is being a stalker and figuring out through social media, what are they posting online that reveals a little bit of who they are and what they want to share. And also to the point of, you know, and taking that language, like what language are they using? The government that in Ontario, for example, loves to talk about efficiencies and innovation and economic growth. So I'm not going to change the issue that I'm advocating for, but I'm going to frame it in a way that matters to them. And just to make sure, again, to the point of there's alignment of what I'm asking for and what they're doing, so that we can move this public policy forward. It doesn't change what I'm asking for, it just changes the way I'm asking for it. And I will do that, you know, depending on who is in front of me, whether it's government official on the bureaucratic side or a politician or decision maker. But you know, that really speaks to the first question that you had. I think every issue is salient. You just have to figure out how to tap into what's relevant, right? So I've just explained to you, because it's literally on my mind 24/7 right now, the cancer clinical trials. That's very niche, right? Like not that many Canadians. It's not like every single person who is diagnosed with cancer is on a trial. It's very niche. But I decided to narrow it down to an issue that I know is relevant, not just to the federal government, but to governments, parties that are interested and likely to form government if there's federal election coming up. And their interest is in research and innovation. So instead of saying, hey, Minister Holland, or hey, health critic, I think that we should make cancer drugs equitable and affordable for all Canadians, which, by the way, was what I was asked to say. They would say, Rose, okay, what am I supposed to do with that? Thank you. Like, of course we want to make cancer drugs equitable and affordable for all. Give me some ideas. So rather than doing a wide scope of this issue, I narrowed it down to something that I know that is being worked on, that has the ability to move forward and is still relevant to Canadians, because it's fitting the various agendas of various political parties, as well as the bureaucratic side, where with CIHR undertaking this work anyway. So I made it relevant to them, even though it's a very niche area. And I'm making it more relevant to Canadians, because I've had some of the researchers that I'm working with write op-eds about it. This is why it matters to you, average voter and average Canadian. This is why your mom is diagnosed with glioblastoma. You will get the treatment you need, because we're going to modernize the system. So taking a niche area and made it super relevant, hopefully, to decision makers, who could then say that I have a clear path for a policy proposal that won't cost billions of dollars unlike other policy proposals. And then part of that is also reading the writing on the wall. We are in a political climate of fiscal restraint. I'm not going to put forward policy proposals that are billions of dollars in the making. I'm going to put forward policy proposals with a clear ask, with a tight budget, and with an impact to Canadians that's very evident in the data that we're putting forward.
Thanks for the questions, guys. We're gonna have to move on because we are running out of time. There are a couple of questions in the chat online, but I think we're gonna have to move along to the next portion. But maybe we'll try to get to them and if we have any more time for questions. I'm just gonna. Pretend that didn't happen. So we're gonna move on to the next slide. Yeah, oh, I'm not in the frame. Yeah, let's move on to the next slide. So, thanks so much for your insight into the strategy that goes into advocating for policymakers. We're going to try and put our own advocacy skills to the test here by outlining a 1-minute policy pitch. And we'll get our expert speakers to give some feedback on our responses at the end. But first, we'll just go over the main structural parts of a policy pitch. So start with the opening line. This you want to focus on drawing the interest of your listener, which is probably a policymaker. So we're trying to relate to their priorities, as we've been hearing throughout the presentations, but also to clearly indicate the issue of focus and why it matters. And then when you present your policy solution, you should offer a strategy, a specific strategy to address the issue that you presented, and make sure that this is something that your representative's level of government has influence over, something that they have the ability to do something about. For your justification, this is where you're providing justification for why your policy solution is a good one. And this could be examples of where similar things have worked elsewhere. It could be research evidence. And this is also where you should emphasize the impact that the policy change could have on your policymakers' constituents. How is that going to matter to people, to Canadians, to Ontarians, whatever the case might be. And then an invitation to further action or further communication. So you can conclude by making a specific ask of your representative that's within their power, like creating a petition, bringing it up at a council meeting, discussing it with other elected officials, maybe setting up another meeting with you or your organization, and offering to keep in touch to help them support your policy issue. For a few additional tips, I think we already went over so many of these ones that we already have, making a personal link with the politician, and avoiding jargon. So you can remembering that you're speaking to someone who doesn't have a scientific background. I thought this graphic from the American Association for Advancement of Science really illustrates the big difference between scientific writing and speaking and communicating to the public or to any non-scientific audience. They're almost like opposites. In science, you start with the background and the evidence, and then you make your conclusions and talk about the importance of your conclusions at the end. In writing for a non-scientific audience, you have to start with the most important things, your issue of interest, why it's important, and then you get on to the evidence and the background info afterwards. To help you get started, we've put together this policy example. You can go to the next slide. We put together this policy example, but you can feel free to use any policy that's important to you. In this example, you can pretend you're speaking from the point of view of someone with experience in public health research, which you may be. And if you need some background info or inspiration for how you might describe the impact of this policy, the article at the first link here describes some of the main benefits and risks associated with early screening for breast cancer. And to participate, we have the second link here where we made a little Google Jamboard. And you can use the sticky note feature to add your ideas to the different sections of the policy pitch. And each slide focuses on a different policy issue, the first one being the breast cancer one, and then there are some blank ones after that if you want to add your own policy issue and outline something according to an issue that you're interested in. We'll take about, I put 15 minutes on here, but let's make it 10 because we're running out of time. And for you to add your ideas to the Jamboard, and then we can have a quick discussion with the speakers at the end about the results. Maria's saying 5. Let's do 5 minutes. Yeah. We can do it. Do you want to maybe even put the Jamboard out while we're, yeah. 5 minutes, go.
I know, sorry.
No. I wanted to let it go on even longer. We had more questions in the chat.
I didn't realize it was a 30 slide.
Yeah.
What's embarrassing at the the Taylor.
Was it?
She had like 84 votes or something.
Really? Oh, wow, okay, maybe I'm wrong.
But you're close, I think.
Yeah,
And you were the youngest, right?
I was the youngest. Well, sorry, St. Luster Hall was
Oh, right.
the youngest. He got elected at
And the-
19. That's ridiculous. I can't even imagine doing that at 19. but
Yeah.
Of that. cohort.
Right. So he was a bio.
He was,
Yeah,
he
but you
was.
were the youngest with the job.
Of that cohort, exactly, so, yeah, it was a typo.
It's no, it's Ottawa bus. Yeah.
That's the one, so it's Chandra passed, right, so, where I had a repeat in 2022, so. Yeah. So you were in Andrea's office then?
I was the health researcher. Yeah.
So,
Yeah, so all things health. So when you guys did the big health bill in 2019.
Yeah.
And then we leaked it right before.
indeed.
That was me.
That was.
That was me.
Oh, my.
Crazy.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, I kept in touch because I bring a lot of the MPPs over to Mark.
Oh, great.
Presentation, so this past year we had. I have no idea how to get something to the budget. I think it just wasn't.
All right, so it's been about 5 minutes, probably. We've got lots of sticky notes on the board. You guys were fast. I'm pretty impressed.
Oh, wow,
Yeah,
we got ideas.
that was some work in 5 minutes. So let's look at the opening line section first. What is the issue? We have many individuals develop breast cancer in the early 40s. We have 12,000 people are diagnosed every year. We've got breast cancer screening in much of Canada is only accessible to people over 50, but many Canadians are interested in the peace of mind of early screening. Prevention is better than cure. It protects both the individual at risk and your pockets. Earlier screening would help reduce the years of life lost to breast cancer. Okay, so what do we think about the opening lines? Any suggestions for improvement?
Well, I could tell you, the breast cancer screening guidelines is actually hugely political, and I'm partially triggered, but that's okay. Is the problem with this, I mean, I think these opening lines are fantastic, but to contextualize some of this is Canada as having a federated healthcare system means that you might have some national policies as guidelines or recommendations that provinces and territories may choose to adopt, but may not. So what we have is inconsistency across the country for the move from 50 to 40, because the prevention task force that's being tasked to find the evidence to make that move is actually not supporting it. And so the opening line is to say, in the absence of the traditional aspects of evidence, here is the compelling reason why you need to shift from 50 to 40. That's the challenge that advocacy organizations like Canadian Cancer Society and others are facing and have faced over the years. And I think done so really well, because Ontario's made the move and some other provinces are making the move as well. So I think a really clear, I can't read because I need glasses for that, but I think there's some really great points that are being made in tying it to the return of the investments in this could be rerouted back into the healthcare system, which I think is a key thing.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the two that jumped out at me immediately were the prevention is better than the cure. It protects both the individual at risk and your pockets. And the one that talks about the number of people that currently don't have access to it or don't get screened. I think together those two form a really compelling kind of opening line. Taps into kind of a political narrative. It starts off with kind of a striking fact that might catch the attention. So that's what jumped out at me.
Great. Okay, let's move on to the next part. So the policy solution, we've got a few different ways of wording the policy solution. One is to provide healthcare funding to increase the pool of patients screened, lower the age limit for the free breast cancer testing for women, open government funded clinics in high density areas so the clinics are better accessible, create widespread training programs for family care physicians to make breast cancer screenings more accessible. Feedback there.
Yeah, I think the family physician one is bang on. We know that screening is accessed primarily through primary care. And when, doing your research is understanding primary care is in crisis. So if you're gonna make a policy proposal that puts burden onto primary care physicians or providers, what are you gonna do to solve that? And it's putting resources towards family physicians and nurse practitioners to help to have an easier access to the policy proposal that you have is a great idea.
Absolutely. Well, and just, as I guess constructive feedback goes, if you compare sort of what Rose was just talking about on that last piece on the family physicians to the one that's right before it, open government funded clinics in high density areas, my mind immediately when I hear that one, the open government clinics, I'm immediately thinking that's a huge implementation challenge. How are we going to do that? Like that doesn't easily to me explain how we're going to achieve the outcome. Whereas getting more specific in terms of let's tap into the existing network of family physicians and see how we can make access to breast cancer screening more accessible through that means, that strikes me as like a more clear and compelling case right off the bat. So just, always think about that. You don't necessarily want to propose a policy solution that's going to immediately beg 1,000 questions on how it's going to be implemented.
Okay, so I think one of the most important parts of the public or of the policy pitch, the importance to constituents and supportive evidence. So let's see what we've got. Anything standing out as particularly effective? The early detection reduces mortality and healthcare costs. Risk of breast cancer screening for women 40 to 49 is lower compared to older women, and the types of breast cancer are more aggressive and have poorer chance of recovery. And reducing the age for publicly funded breast cancer screenings help catch cancers earlier, and treatment will be more successful and reduces the burden on healthcare services. Again, burden on healthcare services. It's sort of similar to, I think.
I mean, personally, if this were me and I was creating, a document that I was giving to a decision maker, all these facts are great, but I would put them right below. I would have 2 boxes. I would have, Julia is, 45 years old and she got screened. They identified, a potential risk. She got early treatment and, is doing well. And then, box number 2, Kathy didn't get screened at this age. They found breast cancer at age 52. She's undergone, multiple treatments, that have been an enormous cost on her family, on the government, on society, et cetera. Like, paint those 2 contrasting pictures, and then below dive in with, these are some of the statistics that show that these 2 case studies aren't just randomly plucked. This is an illustration of the broader population. And that would be my thought.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, that's exactly what the Canadian Cancer Society does. We bring patients' stories to decision makers and say, meet Kirsten. In fact, we're trying to bring our patient, storyteller Kirsten, to meet the Ontario Minister of Health, which was supposed to happen this week, but it didn't. To say this is why it matters to someone like Kirsten, who is a Canadian, who is a person who's impacted it, but strategically is also a voter. And at the end of the day, decision makers on the political side are also trying to get reelected, and you have to tap into what matters to them to help them get reelected again. So I have Kirsten as a voter who might be from the Minister of Health's riding and can talk about the community that she's created because of the challenges she had with not being screened earlier. And now the Minister of Health is hearing there's this whole network of people in my riding who really care about early breast cancer screening. I need to think about that as well. I don't know if that would resonate from your perspective of just like going into that local, the writing specific for the strategic political aspects.
Yeah, absolutely. When you're talking about advocacy on behalf of a larger issue, if you're able to identify when you're meeting a decision maker, people that you could bring with you from that person's riding, your personal relevance, your salience are going up, right? Because they're hearing from people in their community who can talk about the issue in terms that they're going to understand. Gosh, I went to visit my doctor. My doctor's office is, over at near the Mars complex. Oh, okay, I know that. Yeah, whatever it might be, you're making that issue more relevant to them.
All right, let's go just quickly over to the last box. So these invitations to action for the policymakers to meet with the Minister of Health to implement a lower age for screening, or to ask for a meeting and then a joint petition. I'm really interested in knowing like what kind of call to action would be most likely to be acted upon in general.
So I think that the action here is the policy decision to lower the age of screening. And the way I would have framed it if I was to meet with the Ontario government prior to their decision to say, look, you are going to put Ontario as a leader in the country to make this decision. This impacts Canadians, women across the country, but particularly in Ontario, as Ontario having 40% of cancer cases overall. We do this, you are a leader in the country, and I think that might help to to resonate, I think politically, as Ontario continues to want to set itself as a leader nationally. And I think that, you know, in some aspects, petitions might work particularly with opposition parties who want to put that forward to government. In other aspects, but if you're meeting with the government decision maker, you might just have their ask as the policy proposal itself.
Yeah, I guess you first need to identify, right, who are you meeting with? Because if you are meeting with the person who holds decision-making authority, then your ask to them is, I want you to do this, right? Like that's clear. So if you're meeting with the Minister of Health and you have a specific policy ask, or if you're meeting with the Minister of Finance and you have a specific policy ask for the budget, you know, don't mess around on, we want you to sign our petition, or we want you to do this. Like, we want you to do this. We've got the evidence, we've got the case, this is what we're doing. And don't go and meet with them before you have your ducks in a row, okay? But if you're meeting with a backbench MPP or MP or city councillor, someone like me, then at that point, you want to think about how do you best get them engaged and on your side in your advocacy. And there is definitely a hierarchy of different ways that they can be engaged. Like at the base level, I would say is a petition. Like, you know, signing a petition. There are very few examples that I can think of. I can think of a couple, but very few examples that I can think of where a petition solely drove government policy change. So that's kind of your base ask. You know, one up from there would be, we want you to write a letter to the minister. Okay, you know, they're actually putting their name to something, saying I support this, etc. You know, then one up from that is actually getting a meeting with the minister to talk about it and maybe bringing you along to that meeting and showing that they support your case and advocating with you. And then kind of the best thing that you can kind of go for is to get them actively engaged, doing all of the above, trying to get some of their other colleagues involved, etc. Trying to get yourself as one into their bandwidth as one of the issues that they really care about and are going to help kind of carry water on. You know, and if you can reach that level, then you can work on a number of different things. Maybe they can introduce a private members bill that helps move things forward. You know, maybe they can organize a roundtable. Maybe they can help organize a day where you can meet with some of their other colleagues, all of those different things. So you want to think about kind of that hierarchy and think about how ready your proposal is to get to the big decision maker, because that will help you determine what you're going to ask, you know, one of the MPs or MPPs to do.
I think just adding to that is all of those activities, you want to think of what kind of public narrative are you helping that decision maker to have? Will it lead to a media story? Will it help to get their name out there and show them as a champion of the issue that you're fighting for? You get them to basically be your advocate for someone who's not a decision maker in the minister role, then that helps your cause. So if they can get a media story out of it, they look like a champion on this issue, even better.
Such an important point. I often think about if you're meeting with the government, there's like a triangle with three sides. There's your ask, clear, compelling, concise. There's pressure, the different things that you're doing to try and get the government to implement the change. And then if they implement the change, the third part of the triangle is praise, right? Politicians like praise, right? So if they do, you know, what you ask them to do, or maybe they do 50% of what you ask them to do, whatever it is, give them praise and then move back up to the top to your next ask. And if you miss that praise piece, the next time you come around the triangle with an ask, they're going to go, oh, well, last year we gave them $30 million and they didn't even put out a news release thanking us. That group, we gave them $10 million and they threw a whole event and we got media and all that stuff. Let's give them 40 million this year. Like, don't forget that triangle piece. I know it's crass, but it's the reality of politics, right?
So interesting. I think there is another slide, but I don't know if we have time for it. Regarding pharmacare. Oh, in the Jamboard. I think we are out of time though. Yeah, that's okay. Yeah, so thank you so much for your feedback on all of our policy pitch points. TSPN is just going to do a little bit of shameless self-promotion at the end. So if you guys are interested in getting involved with TSPN, seeing what's coming up next for us, what kind of events, what's going on next year, best way to stay up to date is actually to join our Slack group, which the link to join is here. The link will also be on our website, as well as our email list. You can go to the next slide. And then just to give you a little peek at what's coming up next, the second installment of our Research at Work series is coming up on June 6th. So that's going to be a workshop where we talk about writing policy briefs. And we've got Dr. Sharissa Levy coming in to walk us through a case study on writing a policy brief. Unfortunately, we did have a cancellation from Dr. Beatron. Go to the next slide. And coming up soon after that, we're going to be having our TSPN summer social. So again, if anyone's interested in getting more involved in TSPN, finding out what kind of stuff we do, just in like a casual, friendly environment, we're going to be meeting up at the GSU pub when the weather gets even nicer, and we'll sit outside and we'll discuss science policy like nerds.
I love it.
Yeah. And you can go to the next slide. And then later on this summer, we'll have our annual general meeting. Usually that's late July, early August. We'll talk about all the different events and campaigns and activities that we did this year, and you can get a sense of the kind of activities that we do. We'll do some more boring stuff like voting on constitution amendments, and then we'll have our elections in August. So I highly encourage anyone who is even a little bit interested in being involved in planning activities to join the executive team. You'll basically be, like, if you get involved in planning our activities, you'll basically be doing the same kinds of things as if you were on the executive team without the title. So, and the only requirements to join the executive team are to be a member of TSPN, which really just means you've come to at least 2 TSPN events or meetings. So you're halfway there already if this is your first TSPN event. And I think that's pretty much it. Thanks all of you for coming. Thank you so much to Jeremy and Rose for being our speakers. You guys can stick around and talk to us afterwards if you want to, mingle amongst yourselves, talk about science policy like nerds. Yeah, thanks for coming.
Excellent, thank you.
Thanks for having us.
Excellent.